Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to NAM Center Colloquium Series. Today we have a really great scholar, all the way from warm, sunshiny San Diego to the cold weather of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Stephan Haggard, Professor Stephan Haggard, Lawrence and Sallye Krause Distinguished Professor of Korean Pacific Studies at University of California, San Diego. Professor Haggard has been an expert on political economy of developing countries for decades, and he's has so many great publication on South Korean politics, which I work on, and more relevant to NAM Center for Korean Studies. On South Korean politics, he has published research on literally every step of political and economic development of Korea. So one of the early work I read as an undergraduate student was by his critique paper against the colonial development paper. So the paper argued that Japanese occupation paved the way for South Korean development. And then Professor Haggard with his colleagues have a very persuasive and strong rebuttal paper, critique paper against that paper. And that was very enlightening to undergraduate students like me at the time. And then he also have great series of work on economic development, developmental state of South Korea and other East Asian countries, and which led to economic crisis. And he has a great book about the financial crisis of East Asia. I'm sorry. As well. It doesn't. On general developing countries, Professor Haggard also has great series of book on democratic transition, and also recently on democratic backsliding. Today, he's going to talk about political polarization in Korea, Prelude to Backsliding. He already published a very interesting paper about polarization in Korea in a political science journal called Democratization. But today I was told he's going to build on that piece to talk about something broader and something newer about Korean politics and politics of new democracy. So let's give him a big applause to welcome Professor Haggard.
Thanks very much. So I have one piece of advice for graduate students right from the start. Whenever you give a talk, make it useful to yourself. And that's what I'm going to do today. I was going to just give this talk, but I decided that there was something that came out of thinking about some of this work I've done recently that I'm puzzling over. So I'm going to do some things which I have some confidence about, and then I'm going to do something which I have no confidence about and get you guys to help me. Okay, so I'm going to unfold this in 3 steps. Oh, I have to do the obligatory. I really do appreciate you inviting me out. And you can tell, because I'm already jumping into the substance that you made me think about. So thanks to the NAM Center, this is clearly one of the best places in the country to study Korea, and I mean that honestly. And you know, the staff and everyone, Jean and Professor, you have been terrific. Okay, so you know, when you talk, you sort of show your wares. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly summarize some of the key talking points out of this short book I did on backsliding. And there's an article in the Journal of Democracy if you want to take a look at that. And then I'm going to talk about this data, which is just a purely descriptive exercise about polarization in Korea. But then what I want to do is I want to tackle this paper and book. Gi-wook I've known for years. He's a good guy. He's at Stanford. He's one of the top Koreanists in the country. But he's written this piece in the Journal of Democracy in which he basically says Korea is on the road to perdition and is backsliding. And I want to challenge that and raise a set of issues about how we think and know that political regress is actually taking place. And that, in some ways, that's the part of this that is the most interesting to me. Okay, so let's start with backsliding. You know, this is sort of a mixed audience, so let me just give a quick primer on this. the key insight of the backsliding literature is that democracy can fall not to external coups only or outside forces, but is subject to a democratic regress on the part of duly elected leaders. And the duly elected part is extremely important to this because you're starting with a country which is democratic, and then it's becoming less so, okay? And I'll just show you some slides. Well, let me just fill this in a little bit. So by the actions of an incumbent leader, I mean attacks on the constitutive components of democratic rule, which I take to be, I include rule of law in that. So I include horizontal checks on the executive, political and civil liberties, and then the integrity of the electoral system. Because obviously if the integrity of the electoral system goes, you're finished. And that's why there's such a heated debate about that in the United States, because if that goes, then you're not a democracy, okay? So let me just show you some data. So this is a coup case, right? So, you know, Pinochet comes into power, everything shuts down, he stays in power for a period of time, you have a transition back to democratic rule. This is Venezuela, right? And it's really important to see that this is a process which just goes on over decades of just slow erosion, and at some point, you know, Venezuela is clearly no longer democratic. But in the early period, when Chavez came to power, it wasn't self-evident that it couldn't stay democratic, or at least among some, right? So what we do in this book is, and anyone who wants the slides, I'm happy to send them to you, so you don't have to take notes. But what we did was we tried to select, write some selection rules for deciding what cases had undergone this kind of backsliding process. And we can go into the technical features of it, but the core element is that a country has to have some level of democracy and sustain that over some period. And then it has to see some regress from that status quo. And we used the VDEM data in ways that we can talk about if you're interested, but we came up with these 16 cases, and people disagree about this at the margin. Some people have 20, some people have 25, some people have 10, but a lot of the core cases everyone knows and talks about. You know, Turkey, Orban's Hungary, Venezuela, and the United States, by the way. You know, by these indicators, at least using VDEM data, the United States had an episode of backsliding under the Trump administration. But I'll start by signaling where I'm going, that using this particular selection criteria, under no period is Korea actually would be designated as a backsliding case. And that's important because I'm going to come back to the debate about backsliding in Korea itself. So the method, and just acknowledging a crony, Gary Gertz is here. He and I have been working on this method. But the method, for those of you who are PhD students, goes very much against orthodoxy. Because basically what we do is we select on the dependent variable. We select on backsliding. And we try to construct a causal model that we think is associated with backsliding. But the inferential effort doesn't come from standard, you know, experimental or quasi-experimental designs. We're not running regressions. What we're doing is we're asking what cases comport with the model. What cases comport with the model? And so it's more like a regularity approach. But again, the heavy lifting is done by the arguments that are made within the case about what causes political regress in the case. And for those of you who are doing mixed method research, you need to think about how do you combine, you know, statistical analysis within case analysis, because often some of the most compelling parts of mixed method research don't come from the regressions. They come from, you know, demonstrating that what you're arguing is true in the case. And so just to give you a sense, you know, like this is on the right-hand side of the model. You know, these are the independent. This is an example of an independent variable. So this is VDEM data on polarization, which I'll be talking about in Brazil. And, you know, this period here, it marks a reversion from liberal democratic rule. and notice that these indicators of polarization are worsening. And so we try to tie those kinds of developments within the case to what's happening in the political system more generally. One feature of the book, which people tend to ignore, it's a short book. It was in this Cambridge Elements series, about 35,000 words. But there's an appendix to the book online, which has over 250 pages of kind of case analysis of each case. And it's in the cases that a lot of the hard work is done. And this just gives you an example of what the appendix looks like. It combines data with kind of case analysis, okay? Now, in many ways, a lot of what Bob and I are doing in this book is synthetic, because the arguments that we make, except for one, I think in some ways are not, stunningly original. Because almost everyone who works on this topic typically starts with the idea that polarization seems to be wrapped up in this process. And so we talk about polarization. We talk about the way that autocrats' control of the legislature ends up being an extremely important factor in all this. Because if I'm the executive and I control him, and he defers to me, then I can get him to delegate powers to me, which I can then use to actually weaken his power to check me. The way that backsliding unfolds, I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is also consequential because it's typically an incremental process. And I'm going to make the argument that that incremental process itself has a causal effect, because it's difficult to know that it's going on. And American citizens here should know how this feels, right? Is this happening? What's happening? Yeah. That becomes a sort of consequential. Okay, so on polarization, we're actually agnostic about what the ultimate source of this is. So there is a body of work which is trying to pin this down. Because if you're polarized, and that has effects that are quite separate from the dimensions on which you polarize. But there's obviously a lot of debate on this. But one of the things that happens in polarized societies in extremis is that everything kind of gets loaded on one dimension. And by that, what I mean is there's us and there's them. There's maybe it's culture, whatever it is. But the main point is you come to see your political adversaries as fundamentally alien. They're enemies. They're not co-participants in a democratic project. They're others. And that's, obviously has a lot of effects. And, we go through these consequences, but the one consequence I think is in some ways the simplest to take away from this is Folik's. Folik has this little model, which again, for PhD students, if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. And what he basically says is, look, the most detrimental effect of polarization is that it leads me to acquiesce in the bad behavior of my co-partisan. Now, let me unpack that because that was, gibberish political science talk. What I mean by that is that if I feel that the system is existentially challenged by my opponent, then whatever my guy does is fine, because he's defending me from the hordes that are at the gate. And I think this is just an extremely compelling argument. I think in some ways this wraps up what it is that polarization does, which is so challenging, which is that it leads you acquiesce in the bad behavior of your co-partisan, because the challenges are so great. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the legislature's issue. You guys can bring that up if you want. But let me go to this backsliding as a process, because this is something that Adam Przeworski and we and some of the people in Eastern Europe and Masha Geeson noted this with respect to Russia, this great journalist. is that one of the features of backsliding is precisely that the process of democratic regress is gradual. And I think there are two effects of that. One is it's difficult to predict the consequences of any given move. And so there may be ratchet effects. And what I mean by ratchet effects is if I go after the judiciary and the media in the first period, then in the second period, what happens? I don't have the media and the judiciary. And so the next step is sort of entailed in my ability to go after checks in the first period. So that's one cluster of arguments I find persuasive. And we saw in these cases, and this is something I wish we'd done more systematically, that if you look, media and the judiciary is frequently the first step. Control that, and then other things, come easier. And by the way, the end point of this is almost always tinkering with the electoral system. That is, making sure that the electoral system isn't, doesn't generate free and fair elections, right? But there's another social psychology of this, and again, I'm speaking both to undergraduates and graduate students who might be looking for a research project, but there's also this sense of disorientation in these systems, and this is just a frequent feature of the journalistic literature on these systems. It's like, what is Putin doing? What is Orban doing? Is this outside the bounds of the normal? Some of this looks legal, but is it? And there's a lot of obfuscation. I'm now working with a colleague at the University of Houston on judicial backsliding. And anyone here who's interested in legal systems, this stuff is extraordinarily complex to follow. The average voter doesn't know how judges are selected through some intermediate body that's appointed by the president and all of that process. It's very difficult to track. But then all of a sudden, the judiciary is issuing decisions which are highly at variance with, what you would consider normal law. Okay, so that's the sort of wind-up to this. And now what I want to do is I want to segue into a discussion of Korea and this paper with Ye-Lim Chung, which again, if anyone doesn't have access, I'm happy to send them a copy. And what we did was actually very simple. We just basically scraped everything that there is in terms of surveys for the last 20, 25 years, and we just tried to make an assessment, what is happening with polarization in Korea as a kind of case of this, because I'll come back to the fact that I don't actually think the country is backsliding, but that's secondary. So this data comes from the Korean Social Science Data Center, from the East Asian Institute, from the Korean General Social Survey, and it gets at who is polarized, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And for those of you who are Korea specialists, I'm not going to talk about the smaller parties. I'm going to focus on the two main parties, which change names and are sort of fluid in their structure, as Koreanists know. I'm going to look at the movement over time, and then I'm going to say something about the issues around which polarization is taking place in Korea, and then I'm going to come back to the debate about backsliding in Korea, okay? So this is a visualization. I think there's something, is there one slide missing here? Oh no, I wanted to make a point here. What do you see here? This is self-placement on a left-right scale. What do you see here? What you see here is it's normally distributed. Now, I just want to underline how important this actually is. Most people in Korea position themselves in the dead middle between the two political extremes, right? And this is the Americanist critique of the idea that the US is polarized. Because the argument is, if you look at voters, and they're not polarized, right? They just sort of, it's normally distributed. Most people think that, yeah, I'm in the middle, right? But when you look at partisans, that is, people who identify with a particular party, you get a very different picture. And this thing starts to look more bimodally distributed, right, with the two parties. Now if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, these parties overlap significantly. But, if you look down, you start to see, the fact that party identifiers are taking positions on a left-right scale, which are moving marginally towards the extreme. Is this dramatic polarization? No. But we can demonstrate that there is some increase in polarization, that if you identify with one of the parties or the other, you tend to be moving slightly, in that direction and away from the opposing camp. Now, what's interesting about this, though, and this is the first mildly controversial thing I'm going to say about the Korean case, is it looks to me like most of the movement is actually coming from the right. And guess what? That's pretty much an established fact for the United States. I mean, I think that's not that controversial. If there's movement, the movement tends to be coming from the right. And, this picture is a little ambiguous, but what you're looking at in this right-hand slide is the share of people in each party that identify with the extremes, like on a 0 to 10 scale. I'm a 0 or a 1, or I'm a 9 or a 10. What share of the voters in those two parties look that way? And you can see that for most of the period, the conservatives have more that are identifying at the extreme than on the left side of the aisle. But, you could argue it's oscillating. But look, the number of people who are moderates in the middle is clearly trending down some at the margin. Okay? So that would be a sign of this. Now, this is the stuff that I think is most interesting. I'm really curious what the Korean scholars and colleagues think of this. One of the curious features of the Korean political system to outsiders is it just didn't seem that polarized over socioeconomic issues. I mean, the parties were just not fundamentally different on this. And what we've done here is we've actually looked not only at party identifiers, but at activists within the parties. And you can see, like here's a standard question. Do you prioritize welfare over growth? And the conservative position would be no, prioritize growth. And the liberal position would be no, prioritize welfare. And you can see, first of all, it's sort of in the center, but the parties don't differ that much during the first part of this. But then it widens out. And again, for those of you looking for dissertation topics or something, I think a really interesting area of debate is to what extent has the openness of the South Korean political economy to trade, including from China, had the same impact in Korea as it's had in the United States. So, this is, an example of socioeconomic polarization on issues increasing a little bit. And for those of you who study Korea, again, the position with respect to the alliance in North Korea has always been one of the most salient political issues that divide the parties. And the way that question is asked, should we increase aid to North Korea, for example? And you see, that those in the Democratic Party are kind of more inclined to do that, though not hugely so. But then you see, look at the party activists between 2018 and 2020, just sharp decline. No, we shouldn't be giving money to the North Koreans. And so, this issue is also becoming a little bit more polarized, and I'll talk about that when we jump forward. But I want to so that's sort of standard polarization stuff. But I want you to follow me on this data here because this stuff is really interesting. This is from the East Asia Institute. So any society's got a lot of cleavages in it, and anyone who studies Korea knows that the regional thing is important, the class thing is potentially important, and so on. So basically what the EAI survey does is it asks, how different, how far apart do you think different binaries in Korean society are? Like workers and managers, capital and labor, high and low education, wealthy and poor, and so forth. And look at this. Look at what happens to liberals and conservatives. Boom, just dramatic increase in respondents saying, liberals and conservatives, those two are polarized. They're more polarized than the regional issue, than class issues, than wealthy and poor, Yeongnam, Honam, whatever you choose, liberal, conservative, more polarized on that dimension than on other dimensions. And this is a standard measure of affect. So I'm signaling out my colleague here. Say, so how much do I like my party? How much do I dislike his party? Just pure affect. Do I like you or don't like you? And what's interesting is on the right, you see that the Conservative Party in Korea, that partisans of the Conservative Party actually they liking their own party less. They're unhappy with it. And of course, around the time of the impeachment and so on, there's a lot of change there. But if you look at this, those bars are sort of widening on both sides. I don't like the opposing, partisan types. And all of this is tied with, with the whole question of satisfaction with democracy. And this is just so striking to me, but from 2020, the share of people who are dissatisfied with Korean, democracy just, rises dramatically as this marginal polarization is taking place. So all of these things are kind of, risk factors, okay? Okay, this is about politicians, I'll skip this. Okay, so, the bottom line is pretty simple here. Politics, voters, all voters, surprisingly centrist, partisans increasingly polarized, increasingly effectively polarized, polarizing over a range of issues, but perceptions of polarization are even higher. Like, I'm not polarized, I'm not an extremist, but those guys are. And I'm going to come back to that in this last little bit, which I'm going to finish off talking. And it'll take me about 10 minutes, I think, 10 or 12 minutes. So I think I should be roughly on schedule. Okay, so now I'm not going to talk about backsliding, but I'm going to talk about the debate about backsliding in Korea. Because this is the thing that, when I was preparing this talk, that came to preoccupy me. That, there's the social scientist's Archimedean viewpoint. What's going on in this society? Is it backsliding or not? But then you've got the participants in this thing. And what I'm going to argue is that there's a fight going on in Korea about whether backsliding is occurring and who's responsible for it. Right? Okay, so let me go after Gi-wook a little bit. So here are the kind of things that, I think it's fair to call him a conservative scholar. He's not, he's centrist, but he's on the right-hand side of the political aisle, okay? He says, Korea is not bucking, but following global trends as it slides toward a democratic depression. The late Chavez in Venezuela, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines all gained power by democratic means before leading authoritarian regressions. Korea fits this emerging pattern in subtle but serious ways. What does he really mean? Do you mean to tell me that you think Korea is comparable to what happened in the Philippines under Duterte, let alone under Erdogan? And then he says, while various trends betoken democratic backsliding, this is a timing issue, and I think you'll see where I'm going in this. It dates back before the Moon administration. It's fair to say that they've gained force since Moon came to office. That's the charge sheet. Korean democracy's headed down. It's as bad as other backsliding cases that we know have clearly undergone authoritarian regress. And by the way, it got worse under the Moon administration. And look, I don't think you have to be a social scientist to say, what is the data that would underline a claim of this sort? Because there's no consideration of the temporal pattern in Korea. There's no consideration of Korea against other cases. And there's no discussion of the timing and when this might have occurred within Korea with respect to the partisan identity of who's in government. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to show you that this claim is, I mean, exaggerated, maybe too generous, right? So for those of you who are not in the political science world, there's just been this incredible debate over the last 2 years about how to measure democracy. And Dan and I were talking before this, and there's Monk, and then there's Annie Meng and Little, this very well-known piece in Perspectives, which if you're a political scientist, you just sort of have to read. And the purpose of that debate is actually to measure the global trends in democracy. But I'm not going to look at the global trends. I want to talk about this data in the context of a particular case. And so Little and Meng say, look, we shouldn't be using subjective indicators of democracy that are based on expert surveys. So the VDEM data, they contact people like me and they say, can you code this country on the integrity of its electoral system? Can you code this country on X, Y, or Z? And we code this stuff up and they aggregate it and they try to correct for bias. And then they spit out numbers which says country X in 2013 is this democratic or that democratic. And Annie, who's just a terrific scholar, and Andrew Little say, we should really be looking at objective indicators, like do incumbents lose power? Do they transfer power? Is the political system competitive? Are there competing parties? Are journalists being killed? Is this bad? And so she's got these indices, they've got these indices that they construct. And what's your guess on how Korea is coded from 1987, from the first year it goes democratic, all the way through to the present? How would you guess that Korea is coded with respect to the competitiveness of the political system? Huh? No, worse than that. Flatline. At the top of the scale for the entire period from 1987 on that particular measure. And this is what this looks like. I'll give you, oops. This is Freedom House measures. Okay, so, it's in the 80s and so forth, but I'll show you some comparative data on that. Does anyone see any pattern here? I don't. You're talking about these marginal changes. And again, it's at the top of the scale, Now, here it gets interesting with respect to the timing on the partisan side, because now we're going to look at administrations on whether they're right and left. And guys, I don't have to say anything about this, but what you can see is if there's been backsliding in the last 20 years on this aggregate VDEM measure, it has come during 2 administrations. The administrations of Lee Myung-bak and the administrations of Park Geun-hye. And if there's been a reversion of any sort, it's come in the first couple of years of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. Okay, now, you might think I'm just a raving lefty, right? This could be biased. This could be biased, right? And so one of the things we want to get at is what the possible sources of that bias might be. But by the way, just so you know that this is a comparison, doesn't come out. This is a comparison of Korea with the OECD, the advanced industrial states. And notice that under the Moon administration, actually, according to this coding, it performs better, right? Okay, so let me try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. So why is it that these measures of backsliding and subjective ones, why is it that they may be biased? Or why might any measure of backsliding be biased? And one answer that they give is it's possible that what leaders do, and this very much comports with the way I think of backsliding as unfolding, one of the things that may happen is that leaders discover subtle ways to erode democracy that aren't captured by these objective measures. So they sort of innovate in trying to kneecap the opposition. They try to figure out clever ways to shift the balance of political power in the electoral arena in their favor. And so let me, I wrote this little piece 10 years ago that I'd sort of forgotten about, actually, but I quite liked it. You know, some things you write you don't like, and some things you write, you know, they're okay, and some things. But this is nothing, again, it's just a descriptive piece on freedom of expression in South Korea. And I was reading this book by Gi-wook Shin, and Aram Her, who's just this great Koreanist. Those of you who don't know her should look at her work. She actually updated some of the data in this paper, and so I could steal it from her, and I told her, I'm going to steal your data. But so let me give you some examples about the subtle ways in which, and this is just about freedom of expression. I'm not talking about the electoral system, I'm not talking about horizontal checks, I'm not talking about the judiciary, I'm not talking about the executive congressional relations, national assembly relations. I'm just talking about freedom of expression. Well, as it turns out, guys, as some of you probably know, after the transition to democratic rule in 1986-87, Korea kept a national security law on the books. And guess what? During the first two conservative administrations, it was used against, you know, critics. DJ gets elected, you see a fall in the use of this instrument, and then it goes up under the conservatives and comes down. Here's another one that I like. Again, for those of you who follow Korea, you know, the Lee Jae-myung case is extremely interesting in this. And if anyone wants to talk about it, it's a really interesting case to decipher, because this is a guy's the chief, you know, the leader of the opposition party who's basically arrested for making a false statement during an interview on TV. And that's an election law violation in Korea. Well, you know, you've got the progressives are using this instrument of election law violations, and it falls off in 2008, but then it goes back up. And I said this was my favorite, but this is actually probably my favorite, because it's an example of how measures of backsliding really have to be attentive to context. Alan and I were having this conversation earlier today. So in most of the world, libel laws have been decriminalized. And this was actually an interesting movement to decriminalize libel laws. So if I called you an SOB, you know, I couldn't be sued for that, right? But it's not illegal. You know, the libel laws are criminal in South Korea. And look at this trend. You know, the progressives use them, the conservatives use them, the liberals look like they pull back, and in the first, you know, year or two of the Moon Jae-in administration, oops, you know, they're back up again. You know, so there's a lot of, you know, so one possibility here is that you need to get these more subtle measures to really understand what's going on, even though if you aggregate across these, it's not clear where Korea comes out. Okay, but now let me get to the interesting part, and this is sort of where I got to in my thinking on this. You know, we assume that we can unambiguously identify an action which is undemocratic. But what if you can't? You know, what if it's gray? You know, how do we think about that? What about violations not of the law but of norms? You know, what about biased enforcement of a law? So someone violates a law, they're arrested, or they're indicted, but someone who's committed a very similar crime is not indicted. And, you know, the Cho-kuk case, the Lee Jae-myung case, but also the Lee Myung-bak case. I mean, there's a former president of Korea who's been indicted and was sentenced to 15 years before he was pardoned by the current president for corruption, basically, okay? But what we did was we focused, I'm going to focus the tail end of my remarks here on something that Little and Meng say. One of the things they say is look, subjective measures of democracy may be biased because the coders are biased. And so I come in coding the Korean case, coming from the left or coming from the right, and then I take that bias into the coding of the case. And they say that these objective measures don't suffer from that bias, but the subjective measures may. And you know, you've got this time-varying bias in the coders, you know, of these democracy indices. But guys, what if that time-varying bias is a feature of the citizenry of the country? What if that's a feature of the citizenry, that they have biased perceptions of what's going on? And so I want to spend a little time on this data. So I haven't published this or anything, but I'm thinking about it. So we just did a keyword search on this Big Kinds, which is a kind of application that allows you to track mentions of particular things in Korean newspapers, okay? And we did democracy and crisis or backsliding or erosion. And look what's going on here, right? I don't know if is there a top button? Okay, so. Little green button. I don't know. I don't need it. So again, for those of you who study Korea, when does this first spike? 2009. That's under the Lee Myung-bak administration. Then it falls off. And then it spikes at the end of the Park government around the impeachment, the candlelight protests. And then it goes up under Moon Jae-in. But it stays high and constant into the Yoon administration, suggesting that people wrote articles about backsliding in Korea during the Moon Jae-in administration, but they're continuing to write them under the Yoon administration. And they're not talking about Moon Jae-in in 2023 and 2024. They're talking about President Yoon. And so, you know, the obvious conclusion to this is, you know, different parties are, you know, leveling different charges at the opponents. And so what we did was we drew on these media articles and op-eds and academic pieces, and we tried to just identify, you know, what are the discrete things that critics are saying constitute examples of backsliding in this case. And I mean, I don't have to give you the punchline, right? I call it competing charge sheets. And I'm just going to roll through these again for the Korean, you know, Korea. Executive overreach, eradicating deeply rooted evils, the Moon administration. This was an expression he used. I mean, a not good one in my mind, okay? These bureaucratic investigations and purges. Anyone who, you know, follows the Korean news knows about this epic battle between the Minister of Justice and, you know, the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor, who ends up being the president. The fake news bill, the balloon controversy, changing the electoral system. And so, you know, if you read Gi-wook Shin, this is what the charge sheet is. But wait, let's look at the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye administrations. And there you've got frequent executive orders, outright McCarthyism, in my humble opinion. This is from his Independence Day speech. His Independence Day speech, okay? He says, the forces of communist totalitarianism have always disguised themselves as democracy activists, human rights advocates, or progressive activists while engaging in unethical tactics. We must never succumb to the forces of communist rule. So this is a right party which rightly criticized the Moon administration for overstepping its bounds by saying, eradicating deep evils? What are you talking about? And then turns around and says, our adversaries are, you know, subhuman, in effect. And I could go through the rest of this. You know, the freedom of speech is particularly ironic. Blacklist, the Kakao Talk surveillance, criminal defamation, the national security law, NIS, the national, you know, security service of the country basically engaged in messaging on behalf of political candidates for the party. I mean, look, I'm sounding partisan. I mean, it's partly a pox on both your houses here, because this process is sort of, you know, going on both sides. And whenever I hear things about corruption, I just remind people, remember Chae Sil, you know, these foundations that were like $50, $60 million a piece that Chaebol were contributing to in order to what? I mean, come on, This wasn't money that served no purpose. So here are my conclusions. And these are just questions, This is my last slide. How do we measure this thing? How do we conceptualize it? Does polarization not only generate backsliding as you would see it from a social science angle, but does it generate the rhetorical use of backsliding as a political tool as part of the democratic process? And then what do we think of that? Is it just competing conceptions of democracy and we have to live with this? Is this just expected? Views are supposed to differ in a democracy. To some extent, polarization is at the core of the democratic process. I'm running against Gene. Gene's got one platform. I've got another platform. We disagree with one another. Or, are we kind of on more dangerous terrain where these charges of backsliding, and again, it may be on both sides, are part of a sort of invidious effort to blur the boundaries between what's normal and not normal, and to really engage in a kind of disinformation and misinformation campaign. And as you can tell by the way I put the questions, I'm more concerned about the second of these than I am of the first. Anyway, I've probably talked too long, so I'll stop. But thanks very much for everyone for coming. Yeah, a little over. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Haggard, for such an engaging talk on not just on South Korea, but like one of the biggest debate in political science about how to measure democracy and how to measure democratic backsliding. So I would like to invite questions from the floor to Professor Haggard about any topic he just covered, which is very broad. Anyone? And then those who are on webinar, you can type your question, then we will read the question out loud.
I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
Well, I think good talks make you more confused after the talk, which I had a list of questions related to real politics of Korea from the beginning, but I forgot in the middle. So, Yuki?
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your survey measurement on the polarization among the citizens. So in some countries, including the US, sort of self-reported ideology is not generally considered a very precise measure. And partly because different generations interpret the left-right different ways, or some partisans very strong partisans may tend to choose the median location and so on and so forth. And so I was wondering if there is any evidence that applies to South Korean citizens, or maybe no evidence on that. Like that.
You mean something more behavioral?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you this topic? I'm not a behavioralist. Why don't you just talk for another minute on what the kind of measures, the alternative measures are used?
Well, sometimes people can use sort of the like anchoring vignette in order to sort of correct the differential item functioning, which is basically different people interpret the same survey item differently.
Right.
And so or maybe you can ask the respondents compared to this particular person who is known for everyone,
right.
like where is your location and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So if there is any like a validity results for Korean surveys, that'll be I think useful.
Yeah, look, I wish this was more in my wheelhouse, and maybe these results, even the descriptive results, are not, don't really hold up. But I haven't seen much work yet that's pushing in that direction. So I suspect that's going to be the next wave. But I'll make one observation about the margin of error in this data. You know, you could stare at this and you could say, you know, it hasn't been changing a lot, right? I mean, even just, you know, with the potential bias you've identified. So it's not like the story, I walk away from this and I say, well, you know, subject to the correction which you're talking about, I can't say that things have gone haywire. But one thing that has gone haywire is, number one, perceptions of the quality of governance have clearly deteriorated. And perceptions of the extent of polarization. That is, the question isn't where do you position yourself, but how far apart do you think the parties are? Which I think is sort of an interesting measure, because not asking them where they sit, it's just like, what do you think? And that's just gone like this, you know. So again, for those of you studying Korea, pay attention to Yuki, because that I think that has to be done, right? I mean, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steph. It's a great talk. So I guess I'm struck. So I've made the argument that polarization, so there's a lot of talk about formative rifts in societies that polarization feeds upon, and these deep histories. And I've made the argument that recently, you know, a lot of polarization is really just, it's partisan and very political and focused on particular, like, just deep dislike of particular political leaders, and it doesn't need to have a lot of social content to it. It can really be strictly political. I feel like your talk kind of took that to the next level, because you were, when you discussed polarization, it was really, really political. It was very, very much partisan. There was no, I didn't get any sense of it, of a kind of a social polarization that was going on or informing this. And this is, I guess, is a question for all the Koreanists in the room, is how this works. Because I'm sort of thinking about, well, to what degree is there like reinforcing versus cross-cutting cleavages here, right? Because if you think about the United States as one case in other contexts, so urban-rural is a big one, right? So once these things map onto urban-rural, it takes on a particular perniciousness, right? When it takes on like different levels of education, right? It really takes on this additional perniciousness to it. And I guess what I'm just wondering is any of this, we know the regional divide, of course. We know there's no big ethnic divide or linguistic divide that could feed. So is this something that's really floating above society that's not really, I mean, class kind of went away. I guess it was there early on, but then it didn't seem to come into the way people talked about each other, or these rhetorics didn't seem about class per se. So is there a social side to this? And maybe this is less worrisome if there's not. Maybe there's not a kind of social polarization happening that this could feed on, and it really is just at the level of political identity and partisanship.
Well, let me tell a partial story. I don't have an answer to this question, obviously, but let me tell a partial story about how it could even be worse. But let me just remind people of some of the results. So one of the things is, and I don't know if this is subject to your criticism or not, but on the issues, there does seem to be a sort of emerging, division over social policy issues, like taxing the wealthy and stuff like that. So that's widening a little bit, right? So that may or may not suggest that there's some, political economy story here that needs to be told, a Hansen et al. About, what parts of Korea are hit harder by exposure to trade. And, there's also a spatial story in Korea, because you've got these branch plants, but their headquarters are in Seoul, and the money's flowing back to Seoul, and there's a lot of political economy things going on there. But here's a story that almost makes it worse, and several people have pointed this out, including Aram Herr and Meredith Weiss, is that you've got a relatively homogeneous country ethnically, right? So you don't get that divide. But you've long had this division about kind of competing nationalisms and the foreign policy picture. Because here's an explanation. Meredith White has this piece, which I think is really interesting. She says, look, the right has always been able to rely on an anti-communist trope, And so how did the left respond to that? an anti-Japanese trope. So now you get this politics which is tied to foreign policy. And so, you're calling us, Reds, but you're just in the pocket of the former colonizers. And that really surfaced. I mean, it did surface during the Moon Jae-in administration, around the comfort women issue and comfort women. And then there's another version of this in Aram Her, is just like, what is the nation, And you've got this Minjung tradition, which is, the people, sort of progressive, but then you've got other, conceptions of the nation which aren't about that at all, So I don't know if the international, the main response to this is, I don't know if these international cleavages, we should see them as soothing because they don't, get at these fundamental racial or social divides, or whether they can be just as alienating. I mean, I just think the language in that Independence Day speech, this is an Independence Day speech. This is not a casual comment. This is, this guy wrote these sentences, and he's basically saying, look, the opposition is just a bunch of North Korean sympathizers, which, maybe that's true for some, 0.7% of the South Korean left, or 2% or 3%, but that's a us-them divide that's pretty stark, right? Yeah, I can just call on people, Gene.
So I wasn't going to ask a question, but since there seems to be time. In 2019, I was a member, a participant of rallies. Fall 29 was a season of street politics in Korea. And as some of you might guess, I was a participant of pro-Joguk rally, which began really with several slogans that I don't think was or should have been so polarizing. One was to reform the prosecution, and the other was to reform the press, media. And I remember 양극화, which I think is the Korean word for polarization, came into press reports and accounts and columns in a very aggressive way. And once the polarization, 양극화, became the dominant motif, the legitimate call for reforms that I think could have been embraced across the different swaths within both the conservative and progressive parties became something that looks very much like identity politics. And thereupon, things devolved very quickly.
Yeah.
So the question I have, so there's a comment, and it's a very unfortunate one. The question that I have is, having suffered through the trauma of the 2019 Joguk period, I was so shocked in my conversations with friends and people in the academia that I considered to be rather progressive. There was a clear divide between people who consumed or got their information from what Koreans are now calling legacy media, press, both conservative and even 한겨레 and 경향, 한국일보, which were considered either sort of center or even left of center, and people who are consuming their information primarily through online communities, YouTube, podcasts. So in your work, how do you capture this other side that is not readily available in the published format of the traditional legacy media?
All I can do is point to other research, and I can't remember the guy's name who's done this, but there's emerging research that basically shows that if you get your info, and this is strange in the South Korean setting because you might think that the conservative dominance over the print press, with the exception of Hankyoreh probably, but the finding appears to be that is emerging is that the more information you get from online social media, the more polarized you are. So, I mean, it has an adverse effect. You know? Now, you know, again, this stuff is going on in Korea, and this comes back to you. It's sort of with a lag, right? I mean, this kind of work has been done in the United States and other advanced industrial states, but it's sort of starting to be done. But let me come back to your first comment, because it's indicative of this to me. And again, you can accuse me of partisan bias. But let's take the issue of the prosecutor's office, okay? So there's very little doubt that the Minister of Justice was engaged in a kind of ongoing battle with the chief prosecutor. But it's also the case that the chief prosecutor's office in South Korea is unusually independent, but in an arguably bad way, because they have incredible discretion over indictments. There's not a separation of investigation and indictment. And a lot of what the Moon administration arguably was trying to do was to reform a body which was real, you know, it had more independence than it should, right? But is that a debate within a democratic context, or is that one where you're playing with the parameters of democracy? Now let me put it on the other side. I can't remember where I wrote this. I think I had a column for a while at Jungong, but when the fake news bill came out, I was against it. I just thought it was, the Moon administration was struggling with a totally legitimate issue, you know, because it was a fake news bill. It was addressing exactly the kind of issues that we're concerned about here in the United States. But I think virtually all the international NGOs that deal with press freedom gave thumbs down to that legislation. But interestingly, that was finally shelved. That bill was pulled. And so you could argue that if you hold my normative position, that you know, kind of democracy worked. But what this is what I'm struggling with. You know, we're always trying to divorce ourselves from normative priors, but democracy is a set of norms, you know, and you have to kind of take a position on, you know, what you think of the issue. Is a bill like this that ran the risk of, you know, censoring at the margins, is that a democratic thing or not? You know, that's not just an analytic question, that's, you know, a normative question. And, you know, this is an ongoing conversation I have with my wife, who's a philosopher of science. But you know, is the idea that you can kind of purge these normative elements out of your discussion of value-laden concepts like democracy is just a fool's errand, in my view. But then you've got to figure out, yeah, but is there bias? You know, where is it being introduced? How do you, you know, avoid it? And so on. But that was an unresponsive answer to two good questions.
Let me read out a question from one of our online attendees. Sure. It's from a student named Sam Bari at the Department of Political Science. The question on the micro-foundation of democratic backsliding. A recent wave of studies on dictatorship has shown dictators attempt to personalize their power alters the political institution in autocratic regime significantly. For example, the institutional change in a collegial decision-making, as in a classical communist regime and military regime, to a despotically individual rules. Do you see a similar case where the individual leaders in democracies, let's say the president, play important roles in altering the political institution that leads to the democratic backsliding in the effort of personalizing their power? If so, what explains some leaders to tend not to do this?
Yeah, so let me just make a couple of comments here. And this is a very good question. But let me just make a couple of comments on this. So first of all, it's important to remember something about the concept of backsliding. Backsliding does not necessarily lead to authoritarian regress. I mean, you can bounce back, right? And so the question of whether a democracy becomes authoritarian is somewhat different, I think, than the question of whether it's subject to marginal, decay or something like that. But I would go farther than the question, actually. I mean, the effort to expand the personal discretion of the executive is really at the key of backsliding. I mean, that's almost the definition of it. So any theory of this process has to be a theory of not just why they would want to do that, but how they're capable of doing it. And, you know, the weakening of the judiciary, that's directly related to executive discretion. The weakening of the legislature, ironically, is directly related to this. The weakening of the media. I mean, these are all checks which are being removed. So to me, that's almost, you know, constitutive of the concept of backsliding. But the causal factors that lead to that are really what the debate is about. And, you know, the things that Bob and I highlight in this book are, you know, polarization and the role of the legislature and the incremental nature of the process. But it could be that there are other things that, you know, belong in that menu. But to me, that's almost, I mean, I may be getting the question wrong, but that's almost constitutive of the concept. You know, this idea of executive aggrandizement and collapse of the separation of powers. And again, if anyone's working on the judiciary, I've been thinking about this with Lydia Titi, because you can also look at this within these domains. You know, how is it that executives end up weakening judiciaries? You know, we focus on the independence of the judiciary, but what about reversals of the independence of the judiciary? You know, that's again a topic which just, it seems to me, is ripe for picking.
Yeah, so for me, often polarization and populism go together in these discussions, and you didn't talk about populism. I don't know zero about Korea, maybe it's not relevant, but I was kind of curious about the sort of connection between the two.
I just can't get my head around that literature. I can't get my head around populism. And let me just tell you why, in part, okay? And because I think there's a certain degree of homogeneity in the nature of populism in Western Europe and the United States, though it's tangled. But Chavez was a populist. Putin's a populist. And so, you know, it's very difficult to wrap your head around the diversity. Now, look, that may just be the sample that we went after. And because we really tried to look globally, it ended up being a super heterogeneous thing. And we just said, you know, I don't know if we want to hang our hat on that. But I do think it's an issue. Because if you mean something like a conception of democracy that's majoritarian, deeply majoritarian, which, I mean, if you're a liberal, that's troubling, right? But that's there's a Republican tradition. For those of you political theorists, you know, the majority should rule, you know, and the minority be damned. You know, if we decide we're going to disenfranchise you, we're going to disenfranchise you, you know. And so, you know, that element I do see across a lot of these. So that's a kind of unifying factor. And then the other element which, you know, comes up is this we them, and that there's a nation which is the true nation, and then there are people who are essentially outsiders from the true nation, and since the purpose of the government is to defend the true nation. So I think some of those elements are there, but I just see the phenomena across these cases as so divergent that we just kind of, you know, said let's put that at arm's length, you know, so we don't have to deal with it. And I think that critique of that literature is fair too. I mean, it's trying to wrap its head around all very diverse, you know, phenomena.
So thank you for a great talk. Super fan. It's really nice to see you.
Will you delegate more authority to me?
I'm your opposition, so. So my question is like more of like a twofold question. So like back to your definition of backsliding, like how the expansion of executive power and how they seize the legislative sounds to me like this is like backsliding are more likely to happen inside of like presidential system instead of like a legislative centered institution. So because like you mentioned that it takes the political leader like to seize the polarized legislative body and then like eliminate the horizontal check and balance of power. So if that is true, if that is the case, that we see backsliding more likely to happen inside the presidential systems, does it also like when it happened to more legislative-centered institutions, democracies, does the mechanism change over time, or like what constitute the different mechanism of like backsliding?
Right.
So, for example, like inside the presidential election, the autocratic flavor leader, they only need to win one election, which is like the presidential election. But like to me, like maybe the legislative-centered democracies, it is harder to build like a broad coalition, or is it hard to like it takes a multiple elections to take it into effect? I'm just wondering, like, do you have like take on this?
So again, people who are looking for topics, this is interesting, but I'll just warn you, if you go after this presidential parliamentarism thing, we didn't find it, actually. And that was somewhat of a surprise. But I mean, you know, some of the most prominent backsliding examples in the canon are actually parliamentary systems. I mean, think of Poland, Hungary, Turkey, you know. And so then the question, because it's more about, you know, like, so you're right, like the why. And one thing, this is actually the more, in some ways the more, I think, original contribution of the book was the stuff we did on legislators and voting. So the first thing that's really interesting is these backsliding leaders don't come to power necessarily with large majorities. Disproportionality of the electoral system plays a real big role. And you know, a lot of these including in the United States, but you know, a lot of these backsliding executives come into office in highly disproportional, you know, under highly disproportional electoral rules that allow them to have, you know, bare majorities or even minorities that translate even into legislative supermajorities that they can then use to revise the Constitution. I mean, that's the Turkish case, right? So I mean, we were puzzled by this. We were in your camp. You know, we thought, oh, you know, this is likely to be. But there is an interesting issue that you know, the Europeanists here, I think, is really interesting to think about. It is true that the hard right parties in Europe are disadvantaged by the fact that you've got, you know, lots of parties. And then, you know, we don't want to form a government with this party in it. And even if you were to get into a government, you know, it's unlikely that you would, you know, exercise much influence. And you know, I don't know these cases well, but you know, there are obviously counterexamples, Austria and so forth. But you know, there's a question of whether this can happen in a parliamentary system, you know, under these highly disproportional settings. But there's one other thing I wanted to say about causes of this. If the prime minister, the leader of the party, really controls the party and there are just no independent levers of parliamentary autonomy at the level of the individual candidate, that may be, you know, a telling thing. And, you know, essentially that's Orban. I mean, he just controlled all these people, right? But I think this is a kind of interesting thing to play around with, you know, particularly on the European side. Does party fragmentation kind of, you know, block this kind of thing? What role does you know, does the proportionality of the electoral system play? You know, what about internal rules of the party? How much independence do I have? You know, does that play a role? So.
Yeah. So you're almost answering the question that I had in mind, but going back to maybe Dan's point about this, if we're assuming that this is a political thing and this polarization is not driven by the actual social rifts that are in fact polarizing the people, and it's mostly driven by politicians saying it's polarizing, it's polarizing, it's polarizing, and then people picking up on that language and really thinking that things are polarized, and people and the politicians saying they're enemies, they're others, they're them, and people just picking up on those cues, then my question to you is, why has it become strategically beneficial all of a sudden? Like, what is driving, because we have seen that things were not exactly that way, and then things have become gradually so, even in Korea, among partisans. Are we electing parties are we rewarding parties that are doing that? Maybe you can pull from other contexts as well, not just Korea. And for those contexts in which that are rewarding such parties, is there peculiarities, like you said before, maybe there are different structures within the institution that is rewarding these party behavior?
Yeah, okay, I mean, there are two questions there, and I want to separate them out because I want to make sure you understand our argument about one thing. We do not say in this book that there's not an underlying social foundation to this process. We're just saying we can't figure that out. I mean, someone else can figure that out. And I'll just add one little twist to that, because for those of you who are, following the Americanist stuff, I mean, a particular cleavage may not be driven by that, a particular political cleavage may not be driven by the socioeconomic correlate of that cleavage. Let me unpack that. In other words, the underlying source of polarization in the United States may be socioeconomic inequality. That doesn't mean it manifests itself in populism. It may manifest itself in racism. I mean, those two things those two things are different. And that's why it's hard, right? Now, the question about why do you reward this stuff, again, I think we kind of answer that. You reward it because your co-partisans believe that the threat's existential. I mean, look, again, it's just hard to avoid the United States, but I'm on Trump's mailing list. I get the things he says. And if there's one theme that's